So we're gonna work on the installation of the Espar B4L gas heater. In this video, we're installing it into a Transit. That's gonna be where it's gonna be most applicable for the Adventure Wagon systems. If you have another vehicle or setup, you might wanna reference the Espar instructions or another documentation for your specific vehicle. So to start off, we're gonna remove the Transit gas tank. This process is pretty involved, and to kind of preface this video, this whole install is a pretty lengthy and difficult process. So we do recommend going to a professional if you have the opportunity, but we wanted to walk through the instructions so that you can get an idea if you did need to take it on yourself. So to start off, we're gonna jack up the van. We start at the back end of the van, and the idea is we have to remove the gas tank from under the van. So you need enough clearance to work under there and drop the tank and pull it out the side. So you can see here, we jack it up initially and then have standing jacks to hold up that back end. And then we'll move to the front and do the same thing. You may need to adjust this as you move through the install to give yourself more clearance, so make sure you keep your jack on hand and ready to go, because you, again, will have to kind of adjust as you go just to make sure you can get everything out safely. After you have the van moved up to a good height, we're going to move underneath and start the process of removing the tank. There is a pretty good order of operations here, so we want to start with removing the brackets that hold the tank in place. These are site specific, so as you remove them, you want to label the brackets with whatever you have on hand, like a little piece of tape or something, to make sure that it's easy to reference when you're reinstalling them later on. So to start off, we remove the outermost brackets, so the forward and the aft one. This is gonna get them out of the way, and then we're going to give ourselves a little bit of support underneath, so before we remove the second two brackets. After you have the forward and the aft brackets removed, we're gonna move the jack underneath the van with a platform on top. We use a large piece of plywood here. You just wanna make sure it's big enough to support the entire gas tank. Once you have that platform underneath, you're gonna raise it up just so it's touching the tank. And then we're going to loosen those middle two brackets. Note that as you do this, you might have to shift your platform forward or back, because especially if you have a large amount of gas in the tank, as you loosen the brackets, it'll kind of shift or slosh around, causing the tank to move. This is another reason that if you can have your gas tank as empty as possible, it makes this process a lot easier. So as you do this slowly and are able to remove those brackets, you're gonna be able to drop the tank by about 6 inches or so, giving you just a little bit of clearance on top of the tank so that we can undo some of the electrical and the gas line connections. So now we're going to remove the connections from the gas tank itself. The first one we're gonna do is the main fuel line. So this is a large tube that comes out the side of the gas tank. So we're gonna remove this one at the van body. It should be a quick connect. You wanna cap off this tube when you're doing this in case there's gas in the line. So you can see here we're using a rubber glove. You just wanna make sure it's something that's not gonna corrode with the gas coming in contact with it. After you have that one secure, there's a few other connections on the top. There's a little piece of foam on the forward edge of the gas tank that has some connections underneath it. It's kind of hard to see in the video here, but you want to shift that foam to the side and make sure that you disconnect all of the components there. And then towards the back of the fuel tank, you're gonna have your actual fuel pump, and that has some quick connects on there as well as an electrical connection. For the quick connects on the fuel pump, it can be helpful to use a flathead screwdriver or something to disengage that quick connect. When you're working towards the back at the fuel pump, you want to make sure to cap the fuel connection that you disconnect there with a glove or some sort of seal as well. Once you think that you have all of your connections free, you want to slowly lower the gas tank and make sure that there's none that you've missed or are catching. You don't want to put any major pressure on those lines, so it's a good thing to just go really slow and make sure that you've gotten everything. Once all of your connections from the gas tank are free and you've lowered it on the jack, you can move the actual gas tank out from under the van and onto a work surface. We're gonna move on to removing the fuel pump itself and starting that process. The first step we're gonna do is there's a fuel connection that runs from the top of the fuel pump to the back part of the tank. This is a quick connect as well. You wanna make sure to disconnect that first so that it's not holding onto the fuel pump and preventing us from pulling it all the way out. Once you've done that, we're gonna take off this top collar. There's some bolts around the exterior that need to be loosened, and then it'll just lift out of place. This will reveal an inner collar, which needs to be kind of hammered out of place. It locks in with pressure. So we use a mallet here and then just a screwdriver if you're careful to kind of pop it out of place, and it'll kind of pop up as soon as it disengages. After the fuel pump is free, we can lift it out of the tank. You want to be careful here because it will be completely full of gas. So do this slowly, and as you lift it out, you can kind of tilt it to the side and allow a lot of that gas to drain out back into the tank. There will be a little kind of metal tube that you can see here, so you have to kind of lift it out at an angle and kind of twist it out. So do this really slowly so that you don't damage anything. After you've drained as much gas as you can, put the fuel pump in another container because it will probably still leak a little bit of gas as it sits there. There's a small orange gasket around the exterior of the fuel pump as well after you've removed it. This isn't necessary, but we typically take that out and clean it just to make sure that everything is nice and clean when we're reinstalling it later on. After that, you want to put some sort of plastic or covering over the tank. This is mostly to keep any debris from falling into the gas tank while it's open, and it'll also keep some of the fumes from coming out while you're working. Now we're going to move on to working on the actual fuel pump. So the main process for this install is we put in a new standpipe, which basically allows us to pull fuel from the bottom of the fuel tank. In order to install a new standpipe, we're gonna have to drill a hole in the top of the fuel pump unit. So in your heater kit from Adventure Wagon, there'll be a PDF or like a printout where you can cut out a template for this. You basically want your hole to be in between the main kind of two plastic housings on the top of the fuel pump. It's not super precise, but precise enough that you definitely want to use that template and don't want it too close to one side or the other because you need the standpipe mechanism to fit once the hole is drilled. After you've marked your placement, use a punch to create a starting point for your drill bit. We recommend using a small drill bit first and then opening it up as you need, because you definitely don't want it to drift or anything, as this component is really hard to replace. The hole for your standpipe should be about 5/16 of an inch. When drilling this hole, make sure that the fuel pump is on its side. Again, for the same reason we put the plastic over the fuel tank, you want to keep any debris from drilling the hole from falling into the fuel pump. After you've drilled your hole, go ahead and test fit your standpipe to make sure that your hole's the right size and you don't have too much play. That standpipe does have a little bit of a gasket on it, so when we install it, it'll kind of seal it up from the underside. After you've test fit your standpipe and everything is nice and snug, we're gonna move on to bending the actual standpipe itself to make sure that it can run down the side of the fuel pump and hug it nicely. So to do this, we have a kind of pipe bending tool here at the shop. If you have a vise or some other pipe bender handy, it's gonna be really helpful. A lot of times you can rent these from your local hardware store too. But again, with that same PDF template that we had to pre-drill the top of the fuel pump, you're also gonna have a template to where those bends need to be. This is relatively precise, but you can test fit it and kind of make sure that your bends are correct before actually reinstalling it, so you can kind of tweak things as needed. We basically just want it to bend out and around the main part of the unit. As you're making your bends, you want to start at the top of the standpipe from the section that's going to be in that hole that we drilled, and move down the standpipe with your bends, because it'll kind of determine the lengths of the pipe as you go. You can see here that our pipe bender has specific degrees on it. We end up using 45-degree bends. Your tool may or may not have this, but if it does, for reference, that's what we end up using. Once you've bent your standpipe and it matches the template, we're gonna go ahead and cut about 1/4 inch off the bottom. This is gonna keep the standpipe from contacting the bottom of your gas tank. However much you cut off is gonna determine how low of a gas level you can have in your tank and still have your heater function. After you've made your cuts and are happy with it, we're going to test fit it onto our fuel pump. Before doing this, go ahead and give it a nice wipe down with acetone or some other cleaner, just to make sure that, again, we're not getting any debris in or on the fuel pump. During your test fit, you want the standpipe to be just contacting the outside of the bottom of the fuel pump. And you want to make sure that it's just above the bottom of the fuel pump as well, because as we were saying, you don't want it contacting the bottom of the tank to make sure that you can still get fuel up and into that fuel line. If you're happy with your standpipe fitment, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the fuel pump. At this point, you really need a second set of hands because we're gonna have to basically insert the fuel pump halfway before installing the standpipe. There's a couple reasons for this that you'll see as our installers work through the process. But if you install your fuel pump or drop it in about halfway, so that kind of main bottom unit is inside the tank, this will give you the clearance on the outside of that bottom section for the standpipe to fit into the gas tank. So as one person holds, you can install the standpipe and then make sure it's totally seated inside the hole that you pre-drilled in the top. And then we use a little bit of safety wire along the bottom to hold it snug to the side of the main part of the fuel pump. After you've dropped the fuel pump into place and it's in the same orientation it was when you took it out, we're gonna reinstall that first collar. So you're gonna use the same technique of a mallet and a tool to get it to lock into place. You'll know it's in the right spot when the threaded bolts are between the two markings on the actual fuel tank itself. When the first ring is secure, you can move on to the second kind of placement ring and bolt that back down. Again, make sure it's the same orientation that it was when you removed it. The next step is to reconnect that quick connect fuel line to the main kind of opening on the fuel pump. So do that first, and then we're going to move on to connecting the fuel line to the standpipe that we installed. In your heater kit, you'll have some little pieces of plastic kind of connection tubing and then some hose clamps as well. You're going to feed that onto the standpipe, and then the other end is going to get your fuel line from your heater kit. You'll have a hose clamp for both ends of this kind of mechanism as well. If everything is fitting nicely in place, you want to tighten those hose clamps down and make sure with a little tug that nothing comes loose. Now that you have your fuel pump reinstalled in the tank, we're going to move on to reinstalling the tank onto the van. So with a friend, you're going to move the fuel tank back onto that jack platform. Again, make sure that you're being careful here, especially if there's fuel in the tank, as it can kind of shift the weight. Lower the gas tank on the jack and slide it underneath the van in the same orientation that you took it out. And we're going to start redoing the connections that we removed initially. So easiest here is to start the back where the fuel pump is. So we're going to reconnect all the connections here and then remove the plastic gloves or whatever you had capping your fuel lines and reconnect those as well. You can see here the fuel line kind of spooled up on the side of the gas tank. You want to make sure that this is accessible. This is going to be the new fuel line that we're using to power the heater. You just don't want to trap it underneath the fuel tank when you're reinstalling it. You want to also make sure that it's on the driver's side of the van. As you're making your connections, you want to move the fuel tank up as needed. Some have a little bit more play than others, and the more clearance you can have to make the connections makes it a little easier. That back section, you can have the tank a little bit lower, and then the forward section with this main fuel line and the connections underneath that foam pad, you'll probably need to have the tank raised a little bit higher. As you're reconnecting everything, you want to make sure that all the connections are secure, so make sure to give them a little pull to make sure that nothing is loose. Again, you're working here with gas lines and electrical electrical component, so it's really important that you get everything reinstalled correctly. The connections under the foam pad are kind of a like snap-in quick connect, so it'll make a little noise and snap into place, as opposed to like the fuel clamps or the plastic quick connects that you have on the back end. Once you've reconnected the components on the front end of the tank, make sure to put that foam pad back over top the way that you found it at the beginning. After all of your connections are back in place and connected, we're going to reinstall the brackets. So we're going to do this in kind of the opposite order than we did to remove it. So we're going to install the forward and the aft brackets first. You'll have to kind of move your jack back and forth to give you clearance to do this. But once the forward and the back ones are nice and secure, you can remove the jack altogether and install the middle two. Now that you have your fuel tank reinstalled, we're going to move on to installing the fuel pump for the heater. So this is a small kind of unit that's going to be in your heater box. The direction of the fuel flow through this is important. So we mount the kind of output towards the outside of the van. So that's the longer end of the fuel pump. So you can kind of see in the video here how we install it, and just I would copy kind of our orientation and everything throughout this process. Espar does recommend that this is mounted at a 15-degree tilt. This doesn't have to be exact, but it is helpful to have the input be kind of tilted just slightly down, like you can see in the video here. After you have the fuel pump secured onto the van, we're going to install the first fuel line from the tank to the input on the fuel pump. Kind of hold it in place and then cut the line with just a little bit of slack so that you have some room to play with, and then feed it onto the component of the fuel pump and then use a hose clamp to secure it in place. There's a support rib in the van that you can actually feed the line under. This is going to help protect it and just keep it from getting caught on anything or damaged as you drive the van. So we do recommend running it through that support if you can. After you've passed your fuel line up and over the gas tank to the passenger side, we're going to do the same with the electrical line for the fuel pump. After you've got both of those and free on the passenger side and accessible, we're going to secure them in place kind of tight to the van body with some zip ties. This again will keep it from getting harmed as you drive the van. In this shot here, you can see the kind of finished product of the fuel pump being installed and how the electrical and the fuel line run from the fuel pump around the outside of the van and then back up and over the fuel tank. The next step in the process is actually inside the van. So we're going to move onto the passenger side pedestal. So we're going to want to remove this completely, but in order to do that, we need to disconnect all of the electrical connections. This van has an inverter in it from Ford. If your van doesn't have this, you can kind of skip past this section. For the inverter, there'll be 3 electrical connections. These all just have quick connects, so you want to make sure to disconnect all of those from the inverter unit. And then there are 4 bolts, one on each corner of the inverter itself. So you want to take those off and then remove the plastic housing. This will allow you to take the inverter all the way out, and we're going to actually reposition this a little later on. After the inverter is removed, we're gonna remove the actual pedestal. So again, this is gonna have a bolt in each corner. You want to remove those and then lift the whole pedestal out of place and then move it to a work surface. After you have your inverter removed and moved onto your bench, we're gonna actually take it out of the plastic housing that it came with. Because we're repositioning it to the side of the seat base, you're not gonna have room for that plastic housing. So you just want the actual like heater unit itself. We're going to put it on the driver's side of the passenger seat pedestal, if that makes sense. And you're gonna wanna make sure that the bolt holes in the top and the bottom are on either side of the kind of indentation on the seat base. Your bottom ones are gonna end up overlapping it a little bit, kind of on the curve of where that kind of corrugation in the metal starts, but you want to be on as much of an even surface as you can just to make sure that you can get it secured nicely and flush to the metal. When you have the inverter positioned where you want it, use a hole punch or a marker or something to mark those 4 mounting points on the inverter, and then you can remove it and pre-drill your holes. We use a punch for this first to make sure that your pre-drill doesn't drift at all, and then with your drill bit, you're gonna pre-drill the actual holes for your bolts. You can see as we pre-drill these holes, we size up, so we use a really small drill bit and then size up to the one that actually will fit our bolt. This is gonna be a trend throughout this process. The transits tend to have reinforced steel in a lot of areas of the van, which can be pretty difficult to get through. The easiest way is to kind of just go slow and size up in drill bit size as you go, just so you can kind of eat away at that metal little by little. Once you've gotten to the size that you want to deburr your holes and then treat it with some rust prevent that's in the first box of your Adventure Wagon kit. If you're not installing this with a full Adventure Wagon interior, you will want to get some rust prevention, whether that be a Rust-Oleum paint or some other product, just to make sure that you don't get any corrosion down the line. After your rust prevention has dried, you can go ahead and install your inverter. You want the plugs on the inverter to be facing the back of the pedestal, just to give you clearance to plug everything back in once it's back in the van. Now we're gonna move on to cutting out the back of the pedestal for our heater outlet. In your Adventure Wagon heater kit, you'll have a template that will help you get placement for this part. So get that first, and then you'll see here that we'll mark the 4 corners and punch them to have a starting point for our drill, or for our saw. The template will give you placement for both the square hole we're gonna cut out for the actual heater outlet, and then it'll also have 4 holes on each side, or 2 on each side, for the rivets that will hold our outlet kind of unit in place. So you wanna mark the square on the interior of the template, and then those 4 holes on the exterior as well. After you have those components marked from the template, you can remove it, and we're going to first cut our interior hole out, so it's kind of a larger square. You want to tape off around the area you plan to cut, just to make sure that you don't scratch the paint of the pedestal at all. We use a jigsaw for this process. In order to get started, you want to use a drill bit to drill out each corner of the square that you traced out. One corner should line up with one of the kind of cutouts from Ford, so that'll give you a good starting point on that bottom corner. But the rest of them, it's helpful to have a hole for the saw to land in once you're done. After you cut out your hole, you want to either deburr or file down the edges to make sure there's no kind of pieces of metal that have burred out or could catch on anything. And then once the exterior is clean and removed from any sharp pieces, you can go ahead and rust prevent that hole cutout as well. After you've marked the 4 exterior holes and the interior cutout from your template, you want to pre-drill the 4 exterior holes first. These will be where we place our rivets to mount our heater outlet a little later on. After your rust prevention has dried, we're going to get the steel powder coated outlet that is in your heater kit and mount that to the seat base. Because the transit seat base is slanted, there is quite a bit of variation from Ford, so you'll need to use a little bit of pressure to get this to mount flush to the seat base. We typically put the top 2 rivets in first, and then you can use quite a bit of pressure or have a friend press against that unit and keep it flush to the back of the seat base when someone else sets the rivets. Now that your pedestal is prepped for next stages, we're going to move back into the van. If you had an inverter, you'll have some threaded posts remaining on the van floor where your pedestal was. We'll want to remove these because they'll be in the way of mounting our heater. So we use a grinder here. Just make sure to be careful with this process, as it will throw quite a few sparks, and have all of your PPE that's necessary. You want to get it as flush to the van floor as possible, because again, we're going to be mounting our heater over top of this area. We're going to put our pedestal back into place after you've ground down all of those bolts. And again, you want to rust prevent those areas as well. So after that's done and everything is dry, you can mount your pedestal back into place in the same orientation that you removed it. This image here shows kind of general orientation and placement for our heater. Note that in this image, this is the larger Espar unit. They did come out with a smaller unit as well, which will also show placement images of. The installation process from here on out is going to be with the larger unit, but you can follow the same steps with the smaller unit. Your orientation within the seat base is just going to be a little bit different because your unit is smaller. It's going to be the same side to side though. You just want to place it kind of centered front to back in the pedestal. Once you test fit your heater in the seat base, we're gonna move onto the bench. And in your heater kit, you'll have a metal plate and then kind of like a rubber trim ring that's the same size as that metal plate. So we're basically gonna adhere that trim ring onto your metal plate, which is gonna be in the orientation of the rubber gasket being on the van floor. So you can use your heater as kind of a reference here to make sure that you have the correct orientation. Once you have that, you can clean off the metal piece with a little bit of acetone or cleaner to make sure you get a good seal. And then there should be some removable tape on the gasket to adhere it to the metal. So once you have everything clean and dry, you can remove that tape and make sure it's nice and secure and press it into place. After you have those two components together, we're gonna move back into the van, and your van's gonna have a plastic kind of cover underneath the seat pedestal that we need to remove so that we can get a flush fit with the sheet metal of the van. So you can, again, use your heater to test fit here if you need to. So you can put your metal plate down on the floor and then put your heater unit back over top and let it sit into that metal plate. And then that'll give you a good reference on where you need to cut out the plastic, because we only want to cut out the area where we need to place our metal plate for the heater. You don't want to cut out more than you need. So once you have that placement, you can use a Sharpie or something to kind of trace around that plate, and then use a knife to cut through the plastic and remove it. Be careful here to not scratch the metal or the sheet metal of the van. If you do, just hit it with a little bit of rust prevention to make sure that there's no issues or anything down the line. After all of the plastic is removed and you're able to sit that plate flush with the sheet metal of the van, we can use, again, a pen or something to trace through that plate on all of the holes. So you're gonna have 2 larger holes, 4 smaller, and then 1 smaller one in between the 2 larger holes. We're gonna pre-drill all of these, so make sure they're marked really well. Just for kind of reference here, your plate should be shifted all the way kind of to the side of the housing for your seat base. The area where the holes can be drilled through the bottom of the van is pretty small, so we have kind of a small area for error here. There's structural components underneath the van that will be a problem if you're not in the right spot. So definitely pay close attention to these images and kind of reference where we are in correlation to those corrugations in the van. Once you have all of your markings and it seems like it's in that good area where you're gonna have access underneath the van, we're gonna go ahead and pre-drill all of our holes. Note that this whole area is reinforced steel, so it's gonna be really hard to drill through. So leave yourself some time and some patience to do this and work your way up. So start with a smaller drill bit and then work your way up to the size that you need. And just go slow. You're also going to be drilling on a corrugation of the van for the larger holes, which can be difficult. So it's a good idea to use a punch to start out to make sure your drill bit doesn't drift. And yeah, just again, take your time and make sure there's little room for error here and there's not a space where you can move it alternatively. So you want to make sure that you get everything right the first time. Holes drilled, and you can see them all from underneath the van as well. You can go ahead and put some rust prevention on all of the holes that we drilled and then let that dry before moving on to the next steps. After you have your holes drilled, it's a good idea to test fit your plate again and make sure that all the holes are lining up, because your tubing is going to have to pass through not only the sheet metal of the van but also through that metal plate into the heater. Moving underneath the van, we're gonna mount the muffler. So this is gonna get mounted on the outside wall on the passenger side. You want it to be somewhere between your forward wheel and then the first horizontal structural component. It's not super precise, but you do want to make sure it's in between those two components, just because the tubing can only be so long. With your muffler, you're going to have a little mounting bracket, so you want to mount that to the side wall of the van on that passenger side, and then connect the muffler to it using the little nut that's provided. After your muffler is secure in place, we're going to take the tubing. So this is going to be the silver tubing that's included in your heater kit, and one end is going to go from the aft hole that we drilled in the floor of the van to that kind of aft outlet of the muffler. You just want to mark where like your lengths are, so you want to make sure that that tubing kind of hugs the van body and doesn't touch any like fuel lines or electrical components of the van itself. This will get pretty hot, so you just want to make sure it's free of anything else to make sure that you don't have any issues down the line. Once you've routed it where it wants to be, you can make a mark on it and just cut through using any blade that you have on hand. This tubing is pretty thin, so it should be relatively easy to get through. The next piece of tubing that we're gonna attach and connect is going to be our air outlet. So this is gonna come from the forward hole in the van floor that we pre-drilled, and it's gonna kind of just go forward of the heater unit. This is just gonna be our fresh air intake, so it's not super precise on where it wants to be, but again, you want it far enough from all the other components and from the muffler output itself to make sure that those two aren't interacting at all. We want to prep and cut all of these exhaust lines and air intakes before actually connecting them, because we have such a small area to work within for connecting them to underneath the van. Having them all pre-cut and measured and ready before we do that is really helpful. The small hole that we drilled in between the two larger ones is going to be for our fuel line. This can be pretty hard to access, and you do need to get a hose clamp on it, so it's helpful to do this first. This is the fuel line that we fed up and over the fuel tank from the driver's side from that fuel pump. So go ahead and mark off where this needs to be cut to make sure that it's long enough to go into that hole that we pre-drilled and up into the heater unit. And then go ahead and do this one first if you can, just so you have enough clearance for that smaller hose clamp in between the two larger air and exhaust tubing that's coming out. After you have your fuel line installed, it's easiest for us, or we find it's easiest to do the air intake first. So go ahead and attach that to the forward hole that you pre-drilled and use a hose clamp there. And then you can go ahead and move on to the exhaust that connects to the muffler and do that one last. And again, you want to make sure these are nice and secure with the hose clamps that are included in your heater kit. After you have everything connected to the floor of the van, or to the heater via the floor of the van, you can go ahead and move those hoses around where you want them to be, just to make sure again that they're not contacting any other components of the van, and then use the clamps included in your heater kit to secure them to the van body to make sure that they're not loose or will move around while you're driving. The last piece of tubing that we didn't show specifically mounting is the other side of the exhaust. So from your muffler out, you just want to make sure that this goes, we route it out right behind the forward passenger wheel. You want to make sure it's not touching any mud flaps or any, again, components of the van, just because it gets really hot. So you don't want any melting of plastic or anything like that. This first reference image just shows general routing of all of the different components. So you can see the air intake, the exhaust, and a little bit of the fuel line as well. The next image here is an up close image of that routing to the heater unit, so you can see how tight that space is. But you can see it all does fit, but you've got limited room to work within, and you do want to make sure that that black air intake is towards the front and your exhaust, which is the silver tubing, is towards the back of the van. After your tubing is connected to your heater, we can mount the heater from the top side. So there's going to be bolts on all four corners of that plate that are going to go into the pre-drilled holes that we did earlier. After all those are nice and secure, we're going to move on to the electrical portion. So we can reconnect the inverter that we moved to the side of the seat base. Just a reminder that there's going to be 3 plugs. They all should be sized according to what holes they go back into in the inverter. We just want to make sure to get that all reconnected, and then we'll move on to the electrical of the heater itself. So the first thing we're going to want to do is route our thermostat lead. The thermostat gets mounted, or we choose to mount it kind of just aft of your slider door. You don't want it right against the ceiling because it's gonna sense that heat rises, so it's gonna turn off relatively quickly. And you also don't want it too low that it's gonna interfere with mounting your bed. So we kind of house it right above that horizontal track, kind of even with the top of the slider door. So you want to leave enough slack on that side to get it in that general location. So we're going to feed that lead from after the slider door forward, and you want to make sure it can go all the way down that B-pillar and end up in your passenger side seat base. There should be a little space on the side of the seat base to kind of feed it underneath the sheet metal. In your electrical, or on one of the electrical leads from your heater kit, there's going to be a Deutsch connector plugged into the other end of a Deutsch connector, if that makes sense. You're going to unplug that and then install it on the end of the lead that we put to the back of the slider door. We're not actually going to use this, so this just caps off that connection, so we don't have to worry about it. After you've connected the end of the Deutsch connector that we just removed and installed on the thermostat lead by the slider door, the one that you removed it from, we're going to use that as a reference. So you can see here that our installer is just kind of separating the different colored leads going into that Deutsch connector so that you can easily see what orientation they're in, because we're going to connect the other end of a Deutsch connector to the end of that thermostat lead that we fed through the van and back under the seat base. We're going to connect that Deutsch connector. We want to make sure that all of those colors line up with the other end so that we can plug it in and everything matches up and gives us power in the way that we need it to. This part can be pretty finicky. So within the end of your Deutsch connector, there's a little like orange insert. That's where all of your wires are going to feed through, and then that's eventually going to clip into your like gray plastic housing of the actual connector. So you just, take your time here and make sure. The biggest thing is that all of the colors are in the right spot, and that all of the pins, when we get to that in just a second, are clamped on nice and tightly so that they will like seat correctly in the actual Deutsch connector. Once you have all of your leads in the correct spot in that little orange housing, we can move on to stripping the wires. So you're going to strip the end of each wire and then attach the little metal like prong that's going to carry power from the lead into the Deutsch connector. You want to make sure that this crimp is nice and tight and give it a little tug after you've attached it to make sure that everything's secure and nothing's going to wiggle loose. When all of your ends are crimped on, we're gonna feed them through the gray housing of the Deutsch connector. Again, pay super close attention to your orientation here and make sure they're going through the right holes. After you've got them kind of fed through, you can press that orange insert into place, and that's gonna keep everything inside the gray housing and make sure that you can clip that side of the unit that we just wired up into the one from the electrical harness from the heater kit. On your main wiring loom in your heater kit, there's going to be a really long lead that we're actually not going to use. So you can see here that our installer kind of cuts it at the spot where it splits off. Feel free to wait to do this till the end to make sure that you're using all the right sides. It just kind of prevents from a bunch of extra wire cluttering up your seat base. After you've run your fuel line, we're going to move on to the electrical line for your fuel pump. This is going to come through inside the van, so we're going to move between your driver and your passenger seat base. There will be a factory mat and cover over top of this, so you're going to want to remove that, and then there'll be a little grommet kind of towards the driver's side. We're going to pop that out, as you can see here, and then take it out of the van and pre-drill it. You want it just wide enough to fit the electrical line for the fuel pump. You don't want too much give there just because it is a pass-through from the inside to the outside of the van. After you've drilled your hole, you can pull your electrical line through. About halfway for now, we'll pull the rest through to length after we have it connected. But you want to feed the end with the connector for the fuel pump down through the floor, out the bottom of the van, and then you can press fit that grommet back into place. Underneath the van, we're going to pass the electrical over top of the fuel tank. There should be a metal rib that you can pass the electrical line through to keep it protected from the fuel tank itself or any damage underneath the van, and it'll pop out on the other side towards your fuel pump. You can kind of see it in this image on the lower right hand side. Once you have that drop down to the fuel pump, you're going to go ahead and connect that quick connect, and you'll have power to the fuel pump. And then moving back into the van after you've got it connected, you just want to pull it tight through that grommet so you don't have any excess wire underneath the van, and we can zip tie it to the factory wiring that runs along to the passenger side. And you just want that electrical line to terminate inside your passenger seat base so that we can connect it up to the heater a little later on. But after you've done that, and again, if you want to wait, that's totally fine too, we're going to move on to the electrical line that we fed up and through the seat base from our fuel pump. So in your heater kit, you're going to have another little connector that has orange inserts like the one we did earlier, but there's only 2 and your housing is going to look a little bit different. So you want to get that, and then we're going to strip back that electrical lead that we fed up through the seat base from the fuel pump to reveal those 2 wires. They're both going to be green here, so there's not there's not as much care to be paid attention to the orientation of the wires that go into the housing. So you just want to strip back your main sheath, and then we're going to go ahead and strip those wires by like a 1/4 inch or so. And then follow the same process we did before to feed on the orange like little plastic housing units, and then crimping on the pins for the connector. When the pins are crimped on and nice and secure, we're going to feed them into the housing. You should feel a little click when they're seated into place, and then you can push those orange kind of placement or spacers into the housing itself as well. You can see here we use a little tool to help us kind of maneuver and get everything nice and snug into the housing. There's also a little kind of cover that flips up over top that's a part of the housing itself when everything's in place, and that'll just make sure like is the final step to closing up and securing the housing. When that is complete, we're going to plug that into that main wiring loom. There'll be an end with a corresponding housing that'll clip into that, so that's a good kind of tell that you've got everything in the right spot. So once those are clipped in and secure, we're also going to plug in the 2 big, like the biggest units on the wiring harness. Those will be pre-attached already, but they just need to be plugged into themselves. And that should be the final wiring connection that we have from the Espar kit itself. After you plug in the fuel pump power and get that all clipped into place with the housing, we're gonna connect the main power of the heater unit. So if you have an Adventure Wagon kit, you'll have a positive and a negative lead that run from your ground and your fuse block underneath the seat base. And there should be a positive and negative lead coming off the heater unit itself. So there'll be butt connectors to just connect the positive and negative. Red should go to red and black should go to black in this scenario. And you just want to crimp those on and heat shrink them. Again, always do a test pull before the heat shrink to make sure that your crimps are nice and secure. After you have your main power connected, there'll be 2 big like clips or housing units from your electrical kit from your heater. So you just want to plug those into themselves. They have a specific orientation, but it should only be able to plug in one way. You can see here from an aerial shot of all of the connections being made. There are a lot of things happening, so feel free to watch this through a few times to kind of see step by step our installer work through all the different electrical connections. Some of these aren't labeled and things like that, so it can be a little bit difficult to follow, so just take your time. Just as a final check, you shouldn't have any open leads except for that one that we capped that we don't use. That's for a different controller unit. So all of the ends should be plugged in somewhere except for that one off your main electrical harness from Espar. Moving on to the outlet. So this is the main heat outlet into the van itself. So there'll be, this is the main difference between the bigger and the smaller unit as well. The larger unit will have a 4-inch outlet tube, which is a little bit bigger and harder to maneuver. So it can be, this step can be a little tricky, which is why we show it in the video here. If you have the smaller unit, you'll have a 3-inch outlet, which is a little bit easier to position, and you have a little bit more space to work with because the actual heater is smaller. So basically you just want to make sure that you don't cut things too short and have everything in the right orientation and placement that you need before cutting it down to size. In your heater kit, you'll have 2 hose clamps. So once you've like placed everything and measured it out and made sure that you get the right length and cut your outlet down to size, you want to feed on your 2 hose clamps. One's going to go around the main heater connection, and then one will go around the main outlet from that like steel plate that we mounted on the seat base earlier. You can see here there's a little plastic housing that is included in your kit. So this is what that other end of your tubing is going to connect to. So there's a little kind of ring on the back side of it that'll allow that tubing to slip over top, and then your hose clamp to slip over top and tighten down, just to make sure that everything's secure and it doesn't come out of place as the van's moving. When your tubing is all in place, you can move on to actually connecting that plastic trim ring to the steel plate. You'll have some smaller black capped rivets in your kit. These are what's going to be used to attach that plastic housing. It's an easy tell because they're the smallest ones that you'll have in your heater kit. Once the plastic ring is in place, you'll have another plastic cover plate with little vents in it that will just snap on over top. Once your heat outlet into the van itself is installed, we're finished underneath the seat base. So we're gonna move on to mounting our actual thermostat unit on your trim piece. This again is shown in an Adventure Wagon kit. So if you don't have an Adventure Wagon system, you'll be mounting it onto some other panel or component of your van. So kind of take this process as needed depending on your specific setup. In the Adventure Wagon kit, we have a thermomolded plastic piece that we're going to be mounting our thermostat unit to. So we'll basically have a little housing from your Espar kit that your thermostat will clip into. So we're going to mount that to our trim piece, and we're going to pre-drill first just to make sure that everything fits through. And we're also going to pre-drill for the wiring to pass through behind the thermostat. In your heater kit, you'll have a little template. So this is going to help us know exactly where to drill and then how big our holes need to be as well. If you have an Adventure Wagon kit, you can see here that the fabric kind of frays when you drill through it. We're just using a little soldering iron here to melt down the fabric a little bit. If you don't have this, it's not the end of the world because it will be covered up by your thermostat unit, but the fabric can fray over time, so we do strongly recommend using some sort of heat or a heat gun or something to kind of melt those edges to make sure that you don't have issues as time goes on. You can screw your little mounting plate into place, and then we can feed the wires for the thermostat through the other hole that we drilled to the side of the mounting plate, and then clip your thermostat right onto the trim piece. And then this makes it super easy that once we're back in the van, you can use the quick connect for the electrical to plug the thermostat in and then install your trim.